often when politicians from different parties get together, it's at hustings and they're all shouting at each other, and how much nicer it'd be if political conversation was more like this, actually looking for what is in common and inclusivity within our communities. And I think that also comes to your steps, your 32 steps. I really love number 17 about being a good neighbor. Essentially lowering our boundaries. Now, I put the caveat in here: we can only lower our boundaries if we feel safe and we're in a safe space, etc. But once those conditions have been created, I feel like if everyone could lower their boundaries more often, whether they're different political parties, different ideologies, different teams, different faiths, whatever it might be, for people to come together feels really, really important. So this is the answer to your question, I think, Mark. How did I get involved in politics? Well, it definitely wasn't part of the plan. I had no interest in politics whatsoever. In fact, if you'd asked me a couple of decades ago who the leader of the opposition was, I probably wouldn't have told you. And I was going to say shamefully, but I think that's also to do with political education in this country, which frequently doesn't educate people when they're young and have a truly interaction, about what politics is. People just see people screaming at each other on TV, and it's not a surprise that that puts people off, particularly young women. But I was involved as a community theatre actor. So I was working with groups of people in communities around helping them to find their voice. So to give an example, I was working with groups of homeless people. There's an organisation called Cardboard Citizens, which was essentially looking at, if you've been evicted by a landlord, how do you know your rights? And how do you find your voice in order to be able to express your rights? Now, this was created by a guy called Augusto Boal, Theatre of the Oppressed, in the 1970s. He was working in the favelas. Those are some of the poorest communities in South America. And essentially what Augusto was doing, and we learned to do through the Theatre of the Oppressed movement, was work with communities and find the most vulnerable or oppressed people who would describe themselves as oppressed, and look at how they could challenge power or hold the most powerful to account. So homeless people is one example, but I was also doing it for a little while with migrant workers. So if there was a police raid, how would they know their rights? How would they know what questions to ask? And crucially, because frequently they're very sadly not listened to, if you're a bystander who sees what could be an illegal raid going on, what questions should you ask for police in a firm but fair way? And how do you challenge the hostility that might happen? And not say it's always hostile, but if it is a hostile environment, how do you navigate that? And then the final group of people I was working with alongside the migrant workers and homeless people were people who have been in war zones. So again, if you've been in a war zone or you've been in a brutal, oppressive regime, how do you re-find your voice in this country? How do you re-engage with what community can mean and to know your rights? And I really love that work, and none of this is to knock that work. In fact, some days I think I'd love to go back to that work. It felt really important and really urgent. But I kept coming across a barrier, or as a movement, we kept coming across a barrier, which is no matter how articulate your voice is, no matter how much I can help empower someone to find their own voice, to speak truth to power and speak clearly, if there are systemic barriers in place in the whole way that structures are built, then no matter how clear or how much you know your rights, you can't get over those barriers. So it felt like I wanted to get involved in politics to help remove those barriers, or to help communities, crucially, facilitate themselves to remove those barriers. And ultimately, this can't be a top-down approach. It can never be about national politicians or leaders coming down and changing things, but it has to be about empowering people on the ground, grassroots democracy working. And I think there's often a narrative told in this country that we lean towards selfish or individualistic. But I think it's always important to remember that as soon as the pandemic hit, I think it was nearly 1 million people had signed up to mutual aid groups very, very quickly. And actually, people's first response, once they dealt with their own health issues or their own fear, was, how can I help? How can I contribute to this situation? And it's great to hear places where boroughs and councils were stepping in to facilitate that role. And of course, I'm sure Simon would agree, it can't be all the council, all the borough. It has to be with community groups on the ground. And ultimately, the borough is acting as that connector to make sure those things are happening. I think within this, and I think Simon spoke to this really well, I'm always cautious with community that it's not a cover for austerity. So community should always be amplified, it should always be celebrated, and it should always be empowered. But we'll remember in the 2010s, we had David Cameron's idea of a big society. I think the big society as a concept was a beautiful idea, and actually there's very little I can disagree with. but a big society to replace what should be vital public services or what should be government spending is quite sinister. So I think you can make both arguments that we need to invest in public services, we need to make sure that councils are run properly and community groups are given the adequate funding, and we shouldn't be having to rely on charity, because ultimately charity will breed resentment if some people don't have the most basic services to get through. So I think all of these things have got to be balanced. And then just on a final thing before I bounce back to you, Mark, one of the things I love about my job, both as a London Assembly member, but also as deputy leader of the National Party, is just this week. Tomorrow I'm off to Leeds, then Wakefield, then I'm in Manchester, Wythenshawe, and then Stockport. But it almost doesn't matter where I go. Wherever I am in England, there's these amazing pockets of community groups going on where this volunteer work is happening. And I think it's brilliant what your project is doing, which is essentially looking, how can we learn from these projects? How can we make more of these projects happen? And what are the fundamental principles that are making this happen? One of my favorite things about the Green Party is people frequently think we just care about the environment of a planet. And of course, the environment and the planet are very important. I'm not here to say they're not, but there's no environmental justice without racial, social, and economic justice too. And it's really important that we join these dots. And far too frequently, the people who have done the least to cause the climate crisis are the people who are facing the worst impacts of it and are the least resilient to do it. That's both on an international level in terms of what's happening in the global south, and it's also in terms of empire and colonialism and some very complicated conversations there. But it's for practical day-to-day as well, based in the hyper-local communities, making sure that the people who are involved with their local park expand it. So it's not just people who have the time and money to care about their local park, but actually poorer communities, people from ethnic minorities who might not feel like they're adequately represented in some areas. It's really important we look at how to empower people's voices all the time to make sure that everyone's included in the conversation.